Side 5, Objective Bajor, by John Peel. Continuing on page 163. Shakar nodded. That, as you humans say, is the good news. I can tell from your expression that there is also bad, and that it probably outweighs the good. Yes, Sisko admitted. Even if Torque is on our side, I am not sure that his fellow Hive Masters will agree with him that Bajor should be spared. They seem pretty set on making you their next target. Shakar sighed. How can any race be so indifferent to the suffering they cause? He exclaimed. They aren't indifferent, Sisko corrected him. They do feel badly about the whole thing, but they're working on some great design and feel that the needs of the Hive take precedence over the wishes of aliens. Wonderful. Shakar shook his head. So we're going to be attacked by a race that doesn't wish us any harm, but will kill us anyway. That's about it, agreed Sisko. Naturally, my people and I will do everything in our power to stop them, Shakar. I know that, Captain, and we are truly grateful. We also will do everything in our power to stop the Hive. Let us both pray that our combined efforts will be successful. He terminated the conversation. Sisko sighed and settled back. It had gone better than he'd feared. Shakar, at least, was a very rational man, and didn't waste time or words on recriminations or foolish posturing. But there was no denying that this was a dire situation, and their only hope at the moment was one sympathetic alien who might turn out to be completely powerless in the end. Sana was both elated and terrified. When Torque had broken the good news to her that they would not be separated after all, she had at first been thrilled. Her confidence in him had not been misplaced. He had salvaged their relationship without compromising his integrity. Now, however, as she stood prepared to accompany him to the alien vessel, she was having twinges of fear. She had never been off the Hive before. None of her people had, as far back as the first Hive. To leave the comfort and friendship of her people, to risk her life with aliens, that was, quite frankly, scaring her. She did not know what to expect. The only thing that prevented her from panicking and backing out of this trip was Torque's confidence. He had to be as scared as she was, but he trusted and liked these aliens. They had saved his life and the lives of others. That spoke well for them. They lived in a space station of their own, which showed their intellectual evolution. But they terrified her. Aliens. Sana wished she could behave more like a scientist, to simply accept facts and not burden herself with emotional issues. But she could not. The idea of being out among the stars she loved was appealing, and she would be going where none of her race had gone before. She and Torque were pioneers. She wished it were someone else, but it was not. Torque gave her an encouraging smile. Courage, he whispered to her, stroking her shell affectionately. I will not shame you, she promised. I know that, he answered. Ah, here is Odo now. Sana looked around the vestibule as the alien, the first she had ever seen, arrived. She couldn't suppress a shudder and a gasp as she saw him. Forgive me, she said, attempting to excuse her lack of respect. I did not mean to be rude, but you are so... Ugly? Asked Odo. He bent his head to one side and studied her. I am not offended. Others have thought me so before, and doubtless others will in the future. I am sure I must look as ugly to you, Sana stammered. Not quite, Odo replied. But I have the advantage over you. I have met thousands of alien intelligences, and am beyond such reactions. Considering I am your first alien, I think you're doing rather well. Pleased by his understanding, Sana inclined her head. You are very kind. Well, Odo said brusquely, as if embarrassed by the compliment, I think it is time that we left. He looked at Sana and then Tork. Are you both prepared for this? Sana swallowed nervously. Will it hurt? She asked. Not at all. There will be a momentary sense of dislocation, and then you will be on board the Defiant. It is a safe and not unpleasant experience. Odo tapped the badge on his clothing. 3 to beam over. Trying hard not to panic, Sana steeled her nerves for whatever was about to happen. For an instant, there was nothing at all. Then she felt a tingle throughout her body, and her vision seemed to shimmer. When this cleared, her surroundings were utterly different. She stood within a different chamber, on a slightly raised platform. Facing her were 3 beings that were clearly non-Hive. In rough shape and appearance, they resembled Odo, but she realized that there were minor and possibly significant differences. Welcome to the Defiant. The one who had spoken and stepped forward was tall and dark in coloring. This must be the Sisko of whom Tork had spoken. Her guess was confirmed when Tork stepped down and greeted the man. Thank you, Captain Sisko. May I present Sana? She is my assistant and my one-to-be. I'm pleased to meet you, Sana. Sisko smiled at her and gestured for her to leave the platform. Please join us. Thank you, Captain. Sana followed Tork, staying close to him. These aliens were strange-looking and puzzling to her, and at the same time, exhilarating. An alien species. No, several, if what Tork had said was accurate. Sisko finished the introductions. This is Major Kira, and this is Chief O'Brien. Sana bowed her head to each in turn. Kira was also tall, but her nose structure was odd. She also wore some form of ornamentation in one ear, perhaps for some ritual reason. She was, judged by the shape of her unshelled body, a female. O'Brien was stockier, and she guessed probably male. It was difficult to be certain with alien races. Could she judge them by the standards of the Hive? Let's go to the bridge, Sisko suggested. Then we can get underway for Deep Space Nine. Sana followed along as a part of the group, trying to absorb as many details of the craft through which she passed as she could. The alien named Kira fell in beside her. So, Kira said, you're Tork's one-to-be? Does that mean you two have a relationship, then? Sana bowed her head. Yes. As soon as is possible, we are to become one. She wrinkled her snout. Do you have similar ritual arrangements? Yes, answered Kira, laughing. We call them marriages. Ah, Sana nodded. Interesting. Here we are. Kira gestured for Sana to precede her through an open doorway. Unlike the Hive, these doorways slid aside instead of irising open. Moving on the bridge of the ship, Sana stared about in amazement. It looked very complex and busy. It was also very cramped and dark compared to her workspace on the Hive. She realized that space on this small craft was at a premium, but did it really have to be so small? She realized she was judging the aliens again and clamped down on those thoughts. There were several workstations, most of them staffed by the same kind of humans as she had already met. The far end of the room was taken up by a large screen, which was at the moment completely blank. I'm afraid we don't have chairs to fit you, Sisko commented as he led them across the bridge. I'm having some fabricated for the quarters you'll be assigned on Deep Space Nine, though. Meanwhile, I hope you won't be too uncomfortable here. This will be fine, Captain, Tork said politely. Sana could tell that he felt rather confined in the room also, but he was being polite. The aliens were trying their best, after all. Good. Sisko moved to what was obviously a chair designed for his body and sat down. It was weird seeing an intelligent being bend like that without snapping a limb. Helm, set course back to DS9. Warp 5. Acknowledged, the helmswoman answered. There was the briefest flare of sound from whatever powered this ship, and then it settled back down to the background hum again. Are we moving, Captain? Asked Sana. Yes, Sisko replied. The inertial dampers keep you from realizing it, though. fascinating," she commented. "Your technology is truly amazing." Sisko laughed. "I had thought the same of yours." Inclining her head, Sana agreed. "We both have some unique aspects to our lives, I suspect." She glanced up from the screen hungrily. "Is it possible for me to view the stars? I am excited to be out here among them, Captain. I have never been in space before." Sisko glanced at Torque. "I've kept the screen blanked out in case of problems," he said carefully and politely. "And I appreciate the thought, Captain," Torque answered. "But I must get used to the sight of the stars." He looked toward the screen. "This is only a representation, is it not? Perhaps then it will not affect me as strongly." Proud of her mail, Sana said, "And I am with you, my love. I will try and give you strength." How many other males would dare so much as he? "Very well," Sisko agreed. "But if it does prove to be too much for you, I'm switching it off." He moved to one of the panels and tapped in a series of commands. "Get ready," he warned them. "Screen is coming online, now." The blankness vanished slowly, and gradually images started to form. The background was dark, and then thousands of points of light came into view. The stars, and she was among them. Beside her, Torque gave a strangled gasp of shock and terror. She whirled to him in concern. He was rigid with fear, but he had not curled into a ball. Sana could see the tension in every line of his face and body, and his hands were clutched into claws. He was shaking and sweating, but he was fighting off the worst of it. "I am so proud of you," she whispered in his ear. Torque managed a very strained nod of his head, but he was spending almost all of his powers of concentration on fighting the terror that was ripping at his soul. This was a fight she could offer only emotional support for. He would have to wage this war alone. Glancing around, Sana saw that Sisko was watching with concern. "He is all right," Sana informed the captain. "It will get better for him soon. This representation of the stars does not seem to be as hard on him as the real thing." "I'm glad to hear it," Sisko replied, removing his hand from the screen's controls. "As long as you are sure." "I am." She stared greedily back at the screen again, drinking in the view. It was magnificent. "Is it possible to change the angle of view?" she asked. "I should like to see what the Hive looks like from the outside." "Of course." Sisko manipulated the controls again. Slowly, the picture shifted. He was doing this out of concern for Torque, she was certain, and she felt grateful for this. Torque was still rigid, but he seemed less tense now. He really was getting acclimatized to the view. On the screen, the stars shifted, and then the Hive moved into the image. When it was centered, the picture stopped. They were receding from the Hive quite quickly, and the beautiful shape was getting smaller and smaller as she watched raptly. Her home, and the home of her people for thousands of generations. No Hive dweller had ever been this far away in all of history. She felt a pang of sickness, wishing to be back, but that was swallowed up in her sense of wonder. What further marvels lay ahead of her? She was on the adventure of a lifetime. The only cloud over it was the possibility that it might end with the destruction of an inhabited planet if the Hive Masters had their way. Chapter 19. "Rom! Rom! Where are you, you lazy good-for-nothing?" Quark scanned his stockroom angrily. "Here I am, brother." Rom popped out from behind a stack of crates, carrying a barrel of Romulan ale. "I was just—" "Well, don't," snapped Quark. "This is no time for such frivolities. Put that thing down and listen to me." With a grunt of relief, Rom did as he was asked. "What is it, brother?" he asked anxiously. "You look worried." "Of course I look worried, you idiot. Anyone with half a brain would be worried." He glared at Rom. "That's why you're not worried, of course." He handed across a pad. "Here, go and take inventory in storage room 9. "Room 9? Rom looked confused. But you told me never to go in there. Quark sighed, then growled. And now I'm telling you to go in there. Can't you do anything I tell you without argument? Of course I can, brother, Rom said quickly. Isn't room 9 where you store your armaments? Special orders, Quark yelled angrily. Special orders. Remember that. I've put the access code on the pad so you can get in. Rom wisely didn't mention that he already knew it. Of course, I get it, he exclaimed happily. You're going to be selling arms to the Bajorans for their upcoming war. How perceptive. Quark's voice dripped sarcasm. Of course I am. Then we're getting out of here, fast. Rom frowned. But why, brother? Rule of acquisition number 35 states, Don't start quoting the rules to me, snapped Quark. I knew them backwards before you'd learn to stop drooling. War is good for business. Rom, think for a minute. Assuming it won't overload your wiring. Why is war good for business? After considering the question, Rom's face lit up with a smile. Because we can sell weapons to both sides, and medical supplies to the survivors, at vastly inflated prices. Right, Quark replied through gritted teeth. Now, when the Hive reaches Bajor, they aim to take the planet apart for its minerals and whatever else they need. What can we sell them that they can't just take? Nothing? Rom guessed. Right. And the Bajoran race will be wiped out, won't they? So they won't be buying anything. There's no profit to be made in genocide. And once Bajor is gone, the odds are that these aliens will swallow the station next. That's why I'm getting out of here. You can stay if you like. Rom thought about this for a moment. No, I think I'll come with you. Lucky me, Quark snapped. Now, go and check the inventory. I'm expecting some important customers for everything there later today. Nodding over and over again, Rom scurried away. Quark watched him go with a sigh. Then he straightened his jacket and headed back to his office to place a call. It was time to reserve seats on the first shuttle out of here after his business was concluded. 16 calls later, he wound up calling Ops. The face of Lieutenant Soika stared back at him. Quark, the officer said, is there something I can do for you? Yes. The Ferengi could barely control his temper. You can tell me why nobody wants to sell me a seat on any ship leaving this station. Ah. Soika tried to look sympathetic, but failed miserably. That would be because Captain Sisko left strict orders that you were not to leave the station. What? Quark was almost apoplectic. How dare he? He has no right to restrict my movement. I'm not a Federation citizen. I want to speak to him immediately. Soika shook his head. Sorry, Quark. He's not on station right now. But I'll tell him you called and ask him to get back to you, okay? No, it is not okay, Quark yelled. He felt like breaking something, but the only objects close at hand were much too expensive to destroy. Did he say why he won't let me leave? Something about rats and sinking ships, I think, Soika answered. Again, you'd have to ask him. He paused. Have a nice day. The screen went blank. Quark squealed in frustration. We have to be ready for war, Jarrow insisted. He gave Shakar a placating look. I understand how much you loathe the idea, but it is being forced upon us by these aliens. Shakar muttered something under his breath, and then moved across his room to join Jarrow and Kai Wynn. She was seated at the conference table with a regal expression on her face. I understand necessity, Shakar replied, and I've ordered all Bajoran forces mobilized. If the Hive starts to move in our direction, then we'll be prepared to launch an all-out strike to try and stop it. Though the prophets know we've very little firepower, even with all of our forces combined. You're still thinking defensively, objected Jarrow. We have the forces now. We could strike while the Hive is still fissioning, hit it while it is weak. We stand a better chance of destroying it now than we would if it were in orbit above our planet. I don't believe so, Shakar said once again. Besides, Captain Sisko thinks that he may be able to persuade these aliens not to attack. He thinks, scoffed Jarrow. And you are willing to risk the fate of Bajor on what some outworlder thinks. I'm more Bajoran than you are, snapped Shakar. I don't recall ever hearing of any of your exploits against the Cardassians during the occupation. Jarrow shook his head slightly. I am a man of thought, and not of crude violence. Really? Shakar snorted. For a man of thought, you seem to have amassed quite an array of weaponry. Photon cannons, short-range strike craft. He glared at his opponent. And the fate of Bajor does not rest on an outsider. After all, Captain Sisko is the emissary of whom the prophets speak. Isn't he, Kai Wynn? Without missing a beat, Wynn replied, So many think, Shakar. I myself am open-minded. I'm sure you are, Shakar thought. Well, to try and foil the emissary's plans would run counter to the prophet's will, in that case. And none of us would wish to do that, would we? He glared from one to the other. No, Wynn finally replied. We would not. She gave Jarrow a mildly reproving stare. Perhaps our colleague has been a trifle hasty in his urgings, but it was done with the best interests of Bajor at heart, I am sure. Of course, agreed Shakar. But for the moment, I think that the best thing we can do for the safety of Bajor is to pray that Captain Sisko's plan succeeds. A noble sentiment, agreed Kai Wynn. Jarrow simply scowled and turned away. Sana couldn't take her eyes away from the screen as the Defiant prepared to dock with Deep Space Nine. The station looked so small, but she had to keep reminding herself that these people didn't have the same needs or philosophy as hers. To them, she supposed, the Hive must look huge and wasteful. Torque stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the screen also. Only the tension in his body and the haunted expression in his eyes told her that he was still under a great deal of strain. Otherwise, he was covering up his fears quite well. Secure docking clamps, Sisko ordered, and then, stand down. The crew began to power down their systems, and Sisko rose from his command chair to join Sana and Torque. I trust this experience was not too traumatic, he said politely. It was tolerable, Torque managed to say. I was not as stressed as I had feared. Perhaps it is possible, after all, to overcome this agoraphobia. With sufficient incentive, I believe it is, agreed Sisko. Turning to Sana, he asked, And how did you find the trip? Exhilarating, she confessed. To be able to move so swiftly through space, to journey from star to star in so short a time. Captain, this freedom of yours is quite intoxicating. Sisko smiled. I've often thought the same, he admitted. Sometimes I just long for an excuse to get away from DS9 and out into space again. Come, let me show you to your quarters. You can relax a while there before we travel down to Bajor, and you meet with their representatives. Thank you, said Torque. That would be greatly appreciated. I am a little fatigued. Following their host, Sana once again stared all around as they left the Defiant. Many of the corridors they traversed were quite deserted. Aside from the ugliness of the decor, she could almost imagine that she was back within the Hive again. From time to time, though, they passed other beings. Most of them were either human or Bajoran. Thanks to Major Kira's conversations on the way here, Sana had learned that the nose ridges were quite distinctive for the Bajorans. She felt rather proud of herself for being able to distinguish between the two, given such a small distinction. Then she saw one being who was clearly neither. He was a tall, hefty-looking individual, a dull gray in color, with a bare head and a large scowl on his face. Like the humans, he wore clothing. When he was past them, Sana asked curiously, What kind of being was that? That? Sisko smiled. That was Morn. He's most likely on his way to Quarks. He spends most of his life there. What is a Morn? Sana asked. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure, replied the captain. He's the only one of his kind I've ever seen. Oh. Sana was astonished that there might be species on the station that Sisko knew so little about. How many different alien races are there on Deep Space Nine? It varies a lot, Sisko answered. At least 30, I'd say. Sometimes as many as 100. Sana looked shocked. I'm sure you'll get used to it, Sisko laughed. The first 100 aliens are the hardest to spot. After that, it gets really easy. They reached the rooms set aside for Sana and Torque. They adjoined one another, and Sisko showed them how to open the doors and to order food and drink on the replicators. It seemed to be straightforward enough. I have to go to Ops now, Sisko informed them. We'll be going on to Bajor in a few hours, if you feel up to it. Thank you, Captain, Torque replied. I am certain we will be fine with a little rest. Good. Sisko paused in the doorway. I've had the shutters over your windows closed, he added. You can open them if you desire by ordering the room computer to perform the task. I thought it better that way. Torque inclined his head. Your thoughtfulness is most appreciated, Captain. He watched as Sisko left and the door closed. Then he turned to Sana. What do you think? He asked her. Think? She wrinkled her nose in amusement. It is hard to know what to think. There has been so much that is new. But I think that you are right about these aliens, Torque. They are a considerate and intelligent species. In fact, I like them. Good. Torque eased himself into one of the chairs that Sisko had fabricated for them. So do I. They are fascinating, are they not? Yes. Sana stroked his shell in concern. Now, how do you feel? I know how difficult this has all been for you. I am as well as can be expected, Torque answered. He could not lie to her. I do feel uncomfortable, but I know that what I do is for the best. We must correctly evaluate this planet, Bajor. I could not live with myself if the world were destroyed needlessly. Sana was glad to hear this. Perhaps we will be able to convince them to move, she said gently. They do seem to be intelligent. At least as intelligent as our ancestors were when they made the move into space. Surely they will listen to reason. Torque smiled at her. They have brought us here hoping to convince us that their way is best, he reminded her. But they are bright, she objected, so we may be able to win them over to our side. Torque's snout wrinkled. I do not feel that this Sisko is a person who changes his way so simply, he replied. He is a decisive person, and a very strong one. I wish I possessed 1/10 of his conviction and courage. Do not speak like that, exclaimed Sana. She took his hand in hers. What you have already done took more courage than I ever hoped to see in one lifetime. Torque smiled gently and glanced over at the shuttered window. Perhaps you should open the portal. I know how much you hunger for the sight of space again. She hesitated. Are you sure? Yes, he answered. I must get used to it if I am to function on Bajor. I would rather not, of course, but it is my duty. He took a deep breath and steeled himself. Open the shutter. Very well. Sana crossed to the computer and tapped the command key that Sisko had shown her. Computer, she ordered. Open the shutter. Affirmative, the computer replied. With the faintest of hisses, the steel shutter slid aside to reveal a view of the stars. From where she stood, Sana could see a faint glow off to one edge of the window. She glanced back at Torque, who stood stiffly, his face a mask. I can manage, he gasped. It was clearly a struggle, but there was nothing that she could do at the moment to aid him. Sana nodded and then moved forward, drawn irresistibly to the glow. As she neared the window, a new object resolved itself. She stared out across space at the globe she could see. It was small, but quite distinct. She could make out vague whiteness across the blue disk. It had to be the planet Bajor that she was observing. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. Hanging in the blackness of space, the tiny globe seemed so small and fragile. Yet it was a planet that bore all the comforts of life, rivers and seas, flowers and animals, and people and cities. Sana did not care what decision the Hive Masters made about this world. She knew only one thing. To destroy such a work of beauty would be the gravest crime that anyone could ever commit. Whatever the Masters decided, whatever even Torque decided, she was absolutely clear in her own hearts. Bajor must not be harmed. Chapter 20. So, what do you think of our visitors, Major? Sisko steepled his hands and stared across his desk at Kira. She was standing at attention and looking even more uncomfortable in that pose than usual. Personally? She shrugged. I like them. Sana seems like a nice person, and Torque is clearly trying to control fears that are almost tearing him apart. As a species, though, how can I have anything but disgust for them? They destroyed Durain 4. I had friends there, people I grew up with. They're dead because of these murderers. Sisko nodded, empathizing with the struggle inside her. And how do you resolve this? How can I? She asked. All I can tell you, Captain, is that I know my duty. If the Hive does come for Bajor, I'm going back to my world to fight for it. I don't care what you or Starfleet think. I understand, Major, Sisko replied, but I can't allow that. Nor, I suspect, will your government. You're their liaison on this station, and you can't simply desert your post when you feel like it. It's not simply feeling, argued Kira. I have to be where I can do my people the most good. Your place, Sisko said carefully, is where your people say it is. And they want you here, Major. He stood up and walked around his desk to join her. Nerys, believe me, I understand how you feel. When my wife was murdered by the Borg, I wanted to go out and hunt down every last Borg in existence. But I came to my senses. I've even been able to deal with my grief and my loss. But you cannot abandon your post simply because of personal feelings. You lost a wife and friends to the Borg, Kira agreed with sympathy. I may lose my world to these invaders. It's not really the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, Sisko insisted. The scale is different, I'll grant you, but the principle is the same. Nerys, we're both officers. When we put on our uniforms, we assumed duties that go beyond our personal desires. We have responsibilities. Yours is here and now to Deep Space Nine, as is mine. I promise you, I will do all that is in my power to safeguard Bajor. But I need to know that you will be covering my back. I'm pretty certain that Bajor needs you here, but I'm absolutely certain that I need you here. He could see her struggling between her logic and her heart. There was nothing more he could say to persuade her, and he simply waited. Finally, she nodded. You're right, Captain, she said tightly. I should be here, not on Bajor. Whatever you need of me, I'll do. She sighed. But I can't help wanting to be there. Good. Sisko touched her shoulder. I appreciate the difficult decision you've made. Now. He broke off as his desk communicator beeped. Yes, he growled, irritated at being interrupted. What is it? Sorry to disturb you, Captain, came Dax's voice, but there's someone here to see you. He claims it's urgent. Sisko sighed. Who is it? Vedek Yarka, sir. Sisko winced. He'd had dealings with Yarka before. The Vedek was a deeply religious man with his own agenda to pursue. He was absolutely convinced that Sisko was the emissary promised in the writings of the prophets, and the savior of Bajor. His first inclination was to ask the man to go away. On the other hand, Sisko couldn't afford to alienate any of the Vedeks, especially at a time like this. Send him in, he decided reluctantly. That sounds like my cue to leave, Kira said. My sympathies. She had little time for most of the members of the religious orders, outside of the late Vedek Bareil. She nodded to Vedek Yarka as he entered Sisko's office, and the door closed behind her. "Vedek," Sisko said in greeting. "Emissary," replied the monk. He bowed his head and then smiled slightly. His gray beard looked even more grizzled than usual, and his eyes showed lines of stress. "It was good of you to see me. I know how important your time is, especially now." "Well, what can I do for you?" Sisko asked, getting directly to the point. "The upcoming crisis, I imagine." "Naturally," agreed Yarka in his deep, sonorous tones. "Kai Wynn has been to see Shakar, and has adduced a quotation from the third prophecy of Andakai as her reason. I believe she has seriously misinterpreted the text." Sisko spread his hands. "Forgive me, but I'm not an expert on your holy writings, Vedek. I doubt I can be of help in any dispute the two of you may have." "I understand that," Yarka agreed. "However, the text she used is one of the emissary prophecies, and should be correctly applied to you." "I was afraid of that," mumbled Sisko. "Listen and see if you do not agree that it is most apposite to this time of testing we are undergoing." Yarka held up his head and hands and recited, "The land will be torn asunder as great wings hover. Death will be on all who witness, and mourning on the lips of the few who survive. Weep for the lost, the children, the land. Weep, for it and they are no more. In that terrible day shall all my people be one. Stand firm, for one shall protect you, and two shall convert. In their faith, Bajor will be made whole." He looked sharply at Sisko. "You see the significance, of course." Sisko wasn't sure how to reply. He knew that many of the writings of the prophets had been truly inspired in some strange way. The aliens who had created the stable wormhole that was used for travel between the Alpha and Gamma quadrants lived outside of time. They had, however, some measure of interest in the people of Bajor, and had sent 9 orbs to guide the Bajorans. Some of the orbs were lost to the Cardassians, but others still existed in temples on Bajor. Sisko had experienced communion through those orbs with the wormhole aliens. He knew that Kira had seen visions of the future through them. Given that the wormhole beings lived outside of time, such prophecies had at least a smattering of scientific plausibility behind them. On the other hand, many of the writings of the prophets were couched in obscure and sometimes deliberately confusing phrases. Many of them might apply to almost anything, with the right slant placed on them. It was an old trick used by oracles the galaxy over, so they could claim to be always correct. "It certainly sounds like the first part might apply to what happened to Durain," he said cautiously. "But I have no idea what the rest of it may mean." "I understand that, emissary," Yarka said smoothly. "Kai Wynn is claiming to be the one referred to in the second stanza, but it is quite clear to me that you, emissary, are the one it must mean. One shall protect you. That is what you do, is it not?" "It's what I try to do, yes," agreed Sisko, wondering how he was going to talk his way out of this one. "But it could mean almost anyone. Look, I don't wish to be rude, but I am very busy with this crisis, and—" "I understand," Yarka replied. "I shall be brief. I do not know who the other two referred to in the prophecy are, but it is clear to me that in this hour of crisis, you are Bajor's only hope. Only through your faith can this crisis be averted. It is up to you to find the meaning of the prophecy, emissary. It is my task only to bring these words to your attention. I am confident that through you, Bajor will be saved." He bowed again. "And now I have taken up enough of your valuable time. I shall leave you to ponder the meaning of the prophets, and I shall thank you for what you will do. Good day, emissary." He gave another bow and swept from the room. That was just perfect. As if he didn't have enough problems to contend with, now he was being made the object of another obscure prophecy. Sisko sighed. Maybe he'd believe more in these prophets if they only spoke to him in English instead of riddles. Her sense of wonder sated, Sana turned from viewing Bajor back to Tork. He was tense and clearly forcing himself to look, but he had not succumbed to his fears. "How do you feel?" she asked him gently. "As well as can be expected," he said, managing a feeble smile. "But I have proven that it is possible to endure what was once considered unendurable." "You can endure," Sana corrected him affectionately. "You are the bravest person I know, Tork." "If I can do it, then anyone can," he replied. "I have no great strength here, Sana. I have only necessity to drive me. Perhaps this fear of space is not as ingrained in our race as we had thought. Perhaps it is simply that we have always given in to it, instead of challenging it." Sana considered the idea. "It is possible," she agreed. "By giving in to our fears, we strengthen them. By standing up to them, as you have done, we prove that they are not in command of our lives." "I wish I felt better about winning, though," he joked. He moved to the seat and lowered himself onto it. "At least I am gaining some control over one of my troubles, and the others help me to distract my mind from what I see." Sana frowned. "You refer to the problem about Bajor?" "Partly." He gave her a very odd look. "Sana, I am troubled, and there is no one to help me in this struggle in my soul." She moved to his side and rubbed his shell. "I will always help you," she vowed. "But in this matter there is little you can do. I wish you could help me." "I can do at least one thing," she informed him. "I can listen to you. What is it that distresses you so?" Tork gathered his thoughts for a moment, and then nodded. "It will do me well to unburden myself, even if you cannot solve my dilemma," he agreed. "Shortly before we left the Hive, Hosir summoned me to talk with you." "I know of Hosir," Sana said. "He used to be the security master, did he not?" "Yes. When Dran became Grand Master, however, he appointed Raldar to that post, and had Hosir made merely a Hive Master in name, without purpose." He grimaced. "This conversation with Hosir was very short and troubling. He entered some technical data I do not comprehend into my comp, and then said only one thing to me that I cannot get out of my mind." He paused, deeply troubled, and then continued. "He asked me a question. How do you know that the 203rd Hive's rebellion failed?" And he refused to say anything more. It didn't make sense to Sana. "Of course the 203rd Hive's rebellion failed," she said, puzzled. "We all know that. It is in our records. It is part of the sacred texts." "Exactly." Tork gave a deep sigh. "So then why did Hosir ask such a foolish question? Unless it is not as foolish as it sounds." Sana shook her head. "I cannot say. But perhaps I can help you understand the data he gave you. May I see your comp?" Fishing it out of his shell, Tork tapped in the commands to bring up the data. "Here." He passed it to her. Glancing it over, Sana scrolled the screen several times back and forth. As Tork had said, it was in some obscure computer code. Yet there was a little that she could understand. "Most of it is very opaque to me," she admitted, "but I can read portions of it. It appears to be some kind of computer command sequence." "That I had already surmised," Tork replied. "But to what? And why? And why should Hosir give it to me?" "He may not understand its significance either," Sana pointed out. "These codes are very old, in a form of logic we have not used in 1,000 generations. But some of the data is quite clear. I can make out astronomical readings here. I have studied the old texts from the first Hives for data on our home system, and this is written in the same kind of coordinates. And yet, it is not completely the same." She sighed. Perhaps back on the Hive, with access to my computers, I could decode this. Here I can tell you no more. She passed him back his comp. Astronomical data, mused Torque. Why would Hosea wish me to have this? And what significance does it have to do with his question? The data is old, Sana offered, possibly dating before the 203rd Hive. He smiled. That is a link, he agreed. But astronomical data from so long back can have no bearing on our current troubles, can they? I don't know, Sana admitted. As you say, I cannot help you further. He stroked her shell fondly. You have already helped me a great deal. What comes next is on my shell. He sighed. I do not look forward to this trip to Bajor, but it is my duty. I will do whatever is needed. He smiled again at her. Would you mind if I rested a while? I am worn out from my struggles. Of course not, she answered. She glanced back at the window. Shall I close the portal? No, he answered. I must get used to the sight. She considered a moment further. I am not tired, she said. I am too excited. Would you mind if I left you to explore a little? Of course not. But take care. These aliens might be friendly, but we do not know all of them. Perhaps it would be best to ask Captain Sisko for an escort. A wise idea, she agreed. It had already occurred to her. Rest now. I shall be careful. She crossed to the computer. Computer, she asked, turning it on, may I speak with Captain Sisko? One moment. In far less than the promised time, the screen lit up with Sisko's face. Sana, he greeted her. Is there a problem? No, Captain, she answered. It is merely that I should like to look at your fascinating station while Torque rests. Is it possible that you could supply me with an escort? Preferably one who knows science. I have many questions to ask. I know just the person, Sisko answered. She'll be with you shortly. About 5 minutes later, there was a buzz at the door, which Sana answered. She discovered a young, human-looking female there. She had long hair clipped back behind her head, and curious rows of spots running down her face and neck. Hello, Sana, she said cheerfully. I'm Jadzia Dax. Hello. Sana looked back and saw that Torque was resting, his eyes closed, his body less tense. Shall we leave him in peace? A good idea. Dax led the way outside, and the door closed automatically behind him. So, what would you like to see? Almost anything, admitted Sana, but I should very much prefer to talk with you. Dax laughed. That sounds like the perfect cue for the promenade, she answered. Let's go. She led Sana to a marvelous place. They stood together beside a guardrail, looking down on a long curved row of stores and peoples. Sana was astonished and delighted by the variety of goods and aliens that she could view from here. And if she tired of those, she could simply turn about and look out of large windows and at the stars. It was almost too much to take in, and she laughed almost drunkenly. Such a place of wonders, she exclaimed. It is, isn't it? Agreed Dax. And yet I've seen things that make this place look dull and boring. I am sure you must have, agreed Sana wistfully. I have studied astronomy since I was a child, and yet I never expected to experience any of it. Now, here I am. She sighed. I do not want this to stop, she admitted. Please, tell me about some of your experiences. Dax smiled. She had an idea that it would take quite a while to answer even half of Sana's questions. Forgive me for pointing this out, Captain, Kira said as patiently as she could. But isn't time of the essence here? Bajor only has another 4 or 5 days before the Hive arrives. You're forgiven, Sisko replied with a smile. That's quite correct, of course. Then why are we just sitting here doing nothing? Kira demanded. She gestured at the screen on her workstation. Dax is just chatting with Sana. and Tork is catching up on his sleep. I know it looks like we're doing nothing, Sisko replied, but that isn't the case. Sana seems very eager to learn about what it's like to live on a planet. Dax is the perfect person to make her understand. After all, she's lived many more years than the rest of us combined. I think there's a good chance Sana is already in favor of letting Bajor alone. As for Tork, he turned to Bashir, who was hovering close by. Doctor? The medical scanners in his room show that he is under a great deal of stress, Bashir explained, frowning. I'm comparing his readings to those of Sana, who seems to be pretty well adjusted, so there may be a percentage of error here, of course. If he were human, I'd say he was hovering on the brink of mental exhaustion at best, and dementia at worst. Bashir paused, then resumed in a more cheerful tone. Sleep is the body's way of attempting to cope with stress, and it's showing some effect already. I believe that an hour or so more of sleep will do wonders for him. After all, going down to Bajor will be quite traumatic for him. We want him as relaxed as possible before we start. So, as you see, we aren't doing nothing, Sisko added. In an hour, we'll wake Tork and head down to meet the government. Hopefully both Tork and Sana will be sympathetic, and we can sway them. His face became grim. Believe me, I know how important this is to all concerned. I'm just trying to give us the best possible chance of success. After all, we won't get a second chance to try and save your world. We have to do what we can with this. Kira nodded her understanding. I just hope it's enough, she said. So do I, Major, agreed Sisko. So do I. Chapter 21. Now what is it? Yelled Hive. He glanced up from his desk and winced. Oh, Dukat. It's you. Yes, agreed Dukat. Gultar, the situation with the Hive has become worse. Sisko has informed me that they aim to target Cardassia Prime when the split of the Hives is complete. According to the captain of the Karatan, that will be in approximately 1 day. Hive considered the news for a moment. I agree, that's not good news, he snapped. But Gavron and the Third Fleet will intercept this Hive before it could possibly reach Cardassia. So what's the problem? Dukat sighed mentally. The problem is that the Third Fleet may not be sufficient to stop the Hive. I strongly suggest that we have the Home Fleet intercept. No! Hive thundered. He rose to his feet. Dukat, I can understand that you want only what is best for Cardassia, but you don't see the larger picture. He slammed his hand down on the reports on his desk. There have been anti-military demonstrations in 3 provinces. In one case, I was forced to quell the protest before it developed into a riot. My agents inform me that unrest is growing. I need the Home Fleet where it is. Without it, the traitors would feel more secure in their demands and attacks. We cannot afford that. The Third Fleet should be more than sufficient to subdue or destroy this alien Hive. And if it is not, Dukat asked pointedly, then I will turn over command of the Home Fleet to you, and you can have the second shot at the damned thing. Hive snarled. Would that make you happy? Bowing slightly, Dukat said, It is what would be best for Cardassia, Gultar. And not bad for you personally, if you're the man who saved our planet, eh? Hive remarked sourly. Oh, I know you're thinking of the home world first, he said before Dukat could protest. But I know you well enough to know that you're also after something for yourself. I'll have the orders drawn up, ready for implementing if the occasion should arise. Now get out of here, and let me deal with this rebellion problem. Of course. Dukat bowed again and then left the room. Outside, he paused for a moment to ponder the exchange, and then hurried to his private quarters. Once there, he activated his communications unit and then tapped in a series of commands. Good. He was still unmonitored. His safeguards were paying off. Then he keyed in the private line to Ferron Mulak's home. Mulak's startled face looked back at his a moment later. Dukat, he exclaimed. I was not expecting... I know that, Ducat said smoothly. I also know that you're the brains behind this so-called revolt against the military. I assure you, Mulak began. Assure me of nothing, Ducat interrupted. I'm not a fool, and you know that. As I say, I know you're the one behind the planning. Not the front man, of course. And I have not told the Gul Tar what I know. Mulak scowled, and then looked thoughtful. I assume that means you want to make a deal? Perceptive. Ducat smiled. That is indeed what I propose. The military rule of Cardassia is coming to an end. We all know this, especially, I think, Kiev. My concern here is that there be a speedy transition of power with the minimum amount of bloodshed and disruption. To that end, I do believe that I can help you. And why would you do that? Asked Mulak. Because in the new civilian government, you will need someone in charge of the military, naturally. Mulak laughed, short and sharp. And you know just the person for that post, I imagine. All right, Ducat, I'll bite. What do you propose? An alliance, Ducat answered smoothly. We can be of great help to one another, you and I. Sisko had wondered if the runabout would pose a problem for Torque, but the alien had taken his specially prepared seat without a murmur. Sana reclined beside him, their hands entwined in the classic pose of lovers from many cultures. You're sure you'll be okay with this? He asked again. Torque smiled tightly. Captain, I know what to expect now. I am getting more adjusted to the sight of the stars. I promise I will do my best. We can't ask for more than that, Sisko replied. He took his seat beside Kira. Are we ready? Affirmative, she replied, running the final checks on flight status. Ready when you give the word. Sisko looked back one last time. Dax, seated beside the aliens, gave him a reassuring smile. Okay, let's move out. As Kira tapped in the commands, the runabout came up to full power, and then the airlock ahead of them opened to reveal space. It was a strain for Sisko not to look back at Torque again, especially when he heard the sharp intake of the alien's breath, but he had to trust that things would be well with him. The trip to Bajor was too far for a transporter, and the runabout was the only way to get them there. The craft gave a slight tremor as Kira took it through the open lock and then out into space. Everything's fine, she reported. Estimated flight time of 20 minutes, Captain. Excellent. Sisko smiled. I'm going to talk to our passengers, Major. He rose and went aft to take the seat beside Dax. He gave Sana an encouraging smile, which wasn't really needed. The female alien was enthralled with the view out of the windows. Torque, on the other hand, seemed understandably tense, but he was not catatonic, which was an improvement. How are you feeling? He asked sympathetically. Terrible, Torque confessed. But I trust the feeling will pass. If not, I probably shall. He swallowed. Captain, perhaps now would be a good time for us to continue our conversation. It would help to take my mind off my distress. Sisko nodded. I agree. You were going to tell me about the Great Design. That is correct. Torque made an effort to gather his thoughts. When the makers of the first Hive constructed the Hive, they were not simply planning that we flee our world. They had an aim in mind. Since we had to leave our home galaxy, they had aimed us for this one, not knowing precisely what we would find here, but they believed that we would find worlds that contained at least primitive life. The Hive is constructed so that it can reproduce itself, as it is now doing. The first Hive decided that when we reached our new galaxy, the best way to ensure the survival of our race was by duplicating the Hive. To do this, we would need to absorb the resources of a planet. It would have to be one with life of some kind, because we would need the vegetation and other lesser life forms to replace those that had died during the journey. The Hive is an integral mix of technology and the biological sciences, Captain. It was designed to maintain a stable population for the journey, and to contain the resources necessary for their survival. There would, of course, be some attrition over the millennia, and this would need to be replaced when we reached our goal. Once the hive splits, these resources will need replenishing again. Once more, we must have one target world per hive. When they are absorbed, both hives will be at their peak again. The Great Design then calls for one of these hives to return to intergalactic space and make the crossing to the galaxy that you term Andromeda. Once there, it will repeat the fission process. The other hive will remain in this galaxy, and every 1,000 years or so will absorb another world, and then fission. This will ensure the survival of our species. Dax frowned. At the expense of native species to our galaxy, she pointed out. Torque, what your first hive proposed is highly immoral. You steal the life forms and the resources of other species to propagate your own. How can you even try to justify such behavior? Torque shook his head. The hive must survive. Dax, would you not do anything to ensure the survival of your race? No, she said firmly. I would not advocate the genocide of another species, for one thing, which is what you propose to do. Torque, interrupted Sisko, do you yourself feel that you have the right to murder others for your own purposes? People who have not threatened you? No, Torque admitted slowly. But we were threatened and attacked. The Cardassians attacked us without provocation, and then so also did the Duranians. We were justified in defending ourselves. Defending, yes, agreed Sisko. But you didn't have to destroy Durain and annihilate its people to defend yourselves. You could have simply stopped their ships. This had clearly occurred to Torque, because there was pain on his face as he replied, I know, Captain, he agreed. I deeply regret what was done, and I wish that there were some way to spare Bajor, but I cannot see any. The hive must survive, and this way is the way of the first hive. They overcame the insanity of living on a planet and migrated into space. Their wisdom and courage has always inspired us. Their achievements were tremendous, agreed Dax. The hive is a magnificent creation, but has there never been any who questioned the Great Design? Oh yes, Torque replied. We do not suppress thinking. The 203rd Hive, for example, led a terrible rebellion. They wanted to alter the Great Design and to take the hive itself in a new direction. Alter it? Asked Dax, intrigued. In what way? Torque's snout wrinkled. We do not know. The rebellion failed, and their plans never came to blossom. They were expunged from our historical records. He sighed. It was a time of terrible strife and bloodshed. The leaders of the failed revolt were callous beings, unconcerned with everything but their own plans for the hive. They ruthlessly executed their foes, but were in turn overthrown, and justice was restored. And this is all recorded in your histories? Asked Sisko. Yes. Then Torque winced and gave a start. That is what Hoseer must have been referring to. Hoseer? Sisko recalled the intriguing elderly alien. What do you mean? Before I left, Torque explained, he asked me how I knew that the 203rd Hive's rebellion had failed. It is, of course, in the histories of our people. He must have been reminding me that we have a long and proud history. I am a student of it, he added. I have spent years researching the texts. It must be fascinating, Dax commented. It is, agreed Torque. I have discovered that the 204th and 5th Hives quote the writings in a very slightly different way than they are known now. My theory is that over the millennia our sacred writings have mutated slightly in use. Really? Dax smiled brightly. I'm a student of history, too. So you've tracked changes over all 2,716 generations, then? No, Torque admitted. I have not had the time for that. Besides, the most substantial changes appear to have been in the very early hives, which is logical. And intriguing, said Sisko thoughtfully. How large were the changes? Minor wordings for the most part, Torque replied. Very little else. Most of my tutors thought I was wasting my time with such frivolous matters. No, Sisko said. A people is the sum of its history and its present. If your history has been changed... Not changed, Torque objected. The revisions are really very minor. Our history is intact and accurate. Torque, Sana interrupted suddenly. Tell them about the notes that Hoseer gave you. Frowning, Torque answered, But they are not relevant, surely. They have a very advanced astronomy, Sana explained. Perhaps they could tell us what the information means. We could try at least, Dax said. May I be permitted to examine the notes? Torque hesitated and then gave a shrug. I do not see any harm in it. He pulled out his comp and called up the data. Here. Taking the comp, Dax examined the screen carefully. Torque showed her how to scroll through the information. After a moment, she shook her head. It's very hard trying to work it out in your units. She reached under her seat and took out her tricorder. If you have no objections, I'd like to patch it through my tricorder into the ship's computer. Then I can probably analyze it better. It will not harm your comp or change the data in any way. Then I have no objections, Torque replied. But I do not think that Hoseer's message is relevant. Torque, Dax said gently, I'm trying to save Bajor. I'm willing to try anything, even if it doesn't seem relevant. He nodded. I understand, and I wish you good fortune. He turned back to Sisko as she began to work. Captain, I am greatly in sympathy with your aims. I, too, do not wish to destroy a planet, but my first loyalty is to the Hive. I will do whatever I feel is needed to ensure its survival. And I understand that, Sisko replied. I wouldn't ask you to betray your race, but I hope and pray that we can find some other way out of this quandary. He got to his feet. I'd better go and check in with the Major again. Kira had the runabout well in hand, and he knew it. Sisko simply wanted some time to think about what he had just learned. If the Hive was working on a plan that had been determined by the designers of the Hive, it was being treated as a sacred legacy. He could see that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to convince the aliens to alter that great design. Matters were not getting clearer the more he knew. They were getting harder. How could he find a way to persuade a people to change their entire purpose in being? Looks like it might get a little bumpy, Captain, Kira reported. There's a major storm brewing up right near the capital. Nothing the runabout can't handle, of course, but I'm a little concerned about the aliens. Not much we can do about the weather, sighed Sisko. In fact, there's not much we seem to be able to do about anything right now, is there? There had better be, Kira said forcefully. We won't surrender Bajor without a fight. I know that, admitted Sisko, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. As they drew closer to the planet, Sana came up front. I hope I am not in the way, she apologized, but this is the first planet I have ever seen. May I watch? Of course, Kira answered. I'm sure I don't have to tell you to touch nothing, though. She returned her attention to the controls. You can see where we're heading, in fact. That area with the circular cloud formation. Clouds, Sana concentrated. Ah, suspended water droplets in the atmosphere. It is something I know of only theoretically. Well, it's going to become practical knowledge real soon, Kira assured her. We're going through the edge of it. Worried, Sana asked, Is that dangerous? Nah, Kira assured her. She grinned. It might even be fun. Sana watched, enthralled, as the runabout entered Bajor's atmosphere. The craft shook slightly as the air buffeted it. The shields glowed under the heat of entry, kicking off trails of light beside the ship. Torque gave a strangled cry, but when Sisko looked back, he saw that the Hive Master was still with them. He really was getting better at this. After a few moments, they entered the leading edge of the clouds, and nothing but whiteness was visible about them. Sana gave a sigh of disappointment. We'll be able to see again soon, Sisko assured her. In fact, we'll be landing in just a couple of minutes. It might be a good time to get back to your seat. "If you insist, Captain," she said, disappointed. She made her way aft to rejoin Tork and Dax. "We've got landing clearance," Kira reported, "and a reception committee awaiting us, I gather." She grimaced. "I hope it's not going to be too formal." As they left the lower layers of the clouds, the Bajoran capital was spread below them. Both Tork and Sana gasped, though for very different reasons. For a second, it looked as if Tork was about to go catatonic again, but then he managed to relax slightly. "That was disturbing," he admitted. "I wish we could do it again," Sana breathed in delight. And then they angled down, descending toward the council buildings. The view was certainly spectacular as they flew low over the rebuilt city. It was very different from Sisko's first sighting of it 3 years earlier. Then the buildings had been left half-wrecked and despoiled by the Cardassians as they retreated. Now a great deal of civic restoration had taken place. The temples, generally the largest and most ornate edifices, were back to their former glories. The bridges had been repaired, and the gardens the Bajorans so loved were in full bloom. All of which might end very soon. "The Bajorans are very proud of their architecture," Dax commented to Sana. "They consider the raising of buildings to be a work of art." "I can believe it," Sana replied. "It is a lovely view." The roof of the council chambers appeared below them, and Kira brought the runabout down expertly to a gentle landing. After depowering the engines, she sprang the airlock. "Well, here we are," Sisko murmured. He rose and walked back to the others. "Are you both prepared for this?" Tork took a deep breath. "As prepared as I can be, Captain," he replied. "Shall we get this over with?" Nodding, Sisko led the way out of the runabout. Tork followed him nervously, clutching the edge of the hatch as he left. He gasped and shuddered as he looked upward at the open sky. "It is unnatural," he wheezed, obviously distressed. "There is no roof." "It's perfectly natural," Sisko answered. That, of course, was the problem. Tork was completely unused to uncontrolled nature. "It is distressing," Tork commented, "but I will endure." He walked beside Sisko toward the entrance ahead. Beside it waited 5 figures. "Are these the representatives of the Bajoran people?" Sisko nodded. "They wished to greet you as you arrived." His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the group. He recognized Shakar, of course, and beside him, Kai Wynn. Trust her not to be left out of this. 2 of the figures were guard escorts, but the 5th... "Jarrow!" exclaimed Sisko. "I hadn't expected to see you again." "At least," added Kira angrily as she caught up with him, "not this side of a jail cell." "It's nice to see you, too," murmured Jarrow with mock politeness. "At this hour of crisis for our world, we are all patriots first." Kira glared at him. "You're scum first," she snarled. Shakar laid a hand on her arm, but she shook it free. "How could you even think about working with him?" she yelled at her old friend. "Because he's right, Nerys," Shakar answered calmly. "At a time like this, we have to work together." Kira gave him a withering look. "Then check your back periodically," she snapped. "Because one of these days there's going to be a knife in it." "I can see these are going to be very fruitful negotiations," Jarrow observed. "Please, my children," said Kai Wynn, raising her hands. "Can we not present a unified face of peace toward our alien visitors?" She smiled gently. "We are, after all, here to welcome them and engage in discussion of the situation, and not to fight amongst ourselves." "The Kai is right," Sisko said. He hated having anything to do with Jarrow, but there was clearly no alternative. "Shall we go inside?" He glanced up at the darkening sky. "It looks like it may get a trifle moist out here soon." "Of course," Shakar agreed. "Please follow me." He nodded to Tork and Sana, and then led the way indoors. In a matter of moments, they reached the council chambers. The 2 guards took up position at the doors, and Shakar led the others inside. The room was dominated by a large conference table. The entire far wall was made of glass or some transparent substitute, giving a view out into the city below. Torque didn't even flinch at the expanse this time. There were only about a dozen other Bajorans present, all looking grim-faced and anxious. Sisko recognized none of them, which was hardly surprising. Politicians tended to come and go very quickly here. Even though the government had stabilized a great deal under Shakar and Kai Wynn's firm control, the Bajoran people were not happy with the direction their world was taking. Few incumbents were ever returned for a second term. As Sisko had requested, 2 of the leaning boards had been fabricated for Torque and Sana. They accepted their comfort gratefully, while the rest of them took their seats. Shakar was at the head of the table, with Wynn to his left and Jarrow to his right. Sisko, Dax, and Kira were seated by the Hive dwellers and away from the table. This signified that they were not expected to speak unless invited directly to do so. "First of all," Shakar said formally, "I would like to thank Hive Master Torque for attending this meeting. I understand that it involved no small inconvenience and distress to him, and we are grateful." "I am pleased to be here," Torque replied. "I hope that our discussions will bear fruit." "So do we," Shakar agreed, his tone grimmer. "For the sake of both of our people, let us pray that we can come to some accord. First, I must ask, is it true what we have heard from Captain Sisko, that your people aim to bring your hive to Bajor and absorb it, as you did our colony on Durain 4? Inclining his head, Torque said, "Unfortunately, it is. The hive needs replenishing after the creation of 2 daughter hives. Only a world with life forms meets our needs, and Bajor is the closest." "It's what we feared," growled one of the ministers. "They come to steal our pa. We must fight these demons." "Please," said Wynn, in her irritatingly condescending tones. "We are here to talk, not to accuse." She turned to face Torque. "And how may we persuade you not to come to Bajor?" "I do not know," he replied. "The Hive Masters in concert are pledged to this course of action. I can see no way to sway their decision. If it were up to me, I would speak on your behalf. Your world is advanced, and you do not seem to be too insane. But I am only one voice, and unlikely to be heard." "Then what is the point of this meeting?" exclaimed Jarrow. "If nothing we can do or say will persuade you, why are you here?" "To offer you help," Torque answered, surprised. "We will lend you ships and help you to build a space colony. Or we will even help you to relocate to another world, if that is your desire." "Relocate?" Shakar appeared stunned. "You have no understanding of what you are asking. We could never leave Bajor." Torque began to tremble. "But you must," he insisted. "If you do not leave, you will be annihilated when the hive absorbs your world. You cannot remain." Shakar leaped to his feet. "We cannot leave," he roared. "It is you who do not understand. For 100 years the Cardassians ruled our world, grinding our people under their boots. We fought back for every inch of this world. It is our world, and not one of us will simply walk away and hand it over to you. If your hive comes here, we will fight while there is a single Bajoran alive. If we die with our world." "This is insanity," Torque exclaimed, very agitated. "It is not logical to die for a handful of dirt." "It may not be logical," spat Jarrow, "but we are Bajorans. This is our home. We will defend it, or perish in the attempt. You cannot have even a handful of our dirt unless you trample across all our murdered bodies first." Torque shook his head from side to side. "No," he protested. "This cannot be. I beg you, do not do this. Let us help you to leave, to find a new home." "There can be no other home for us," Kai Wynn said. She stood also. "This is our only home. The prophets have assured us of this. We could not leave, even if we wished. It is our destiny, Planet and people are linked through faith. The prophets will protect us. She looked directly at Sisko. The emissary will protect us. Your plans will fail because they are born of unbelief and evil. There's nothing like waving the flag, muttered Kira. Utterly bewildered, Torque stared about the room at the hostile, implacable faces. You must speak reason, he protested. We wish to help you to live. We do not wish to kill you. If you insist on following through with your plan, Shakar informed him coldly, then you will have to kill us, each and every living Bajoran. If you can. His face was filled with anger. And we will all die cursing you and your entire race. You seem to have a conscience, Wynne added. Can you live with yourself knowing that you have caused the death of an entire race? But this is not necessary, protested Torque. You have made it necessary, Shakar replied. It is only a planet, Torque exclaimed. A ball of water, mud, and rock. It is not worth dying for. It is our home, Jarrow said. It is not worth living without. At that instant, the sky outside seemed to bubble with blackness, and a forked arc of lightning slashed across their view. Torque gave a strangled cry of panic even before the loud clap of thunder shook the room. Then he shrieked and dived to the floor. You see, he howled, it is madness to live on a planet. It is filled with violence and unpredictability. You are all insane to live like this. A second bolt shattered the sky outside, and Torque shriveled into a ball, only his shell now visible. Sisko stared at the catatonic alien and sighed. This conference could hardly have gone any worse. Torque's overly wound-up nerves had finally snapped, and he had retreated from the reality he couldn't handle. Sisko glanced across at Sana, who looked nervous, but not yet panicking. He will recover soon, she promised. But this weather is too much for him. There is clearly little purpose in further talk in any event, Shakar said. Your minds are made up, and so are ours. It seems that we have no recourse left to us but war. I wish it could be otherwise, Sana said sorrowfully. I do not believe that it is right to destroy this planet. You have a fine civilization, and I would regret its destruction. It may not come to that, Jarrow said smoothly. There is another option. And what is that? Asked Shakar. This. Jarrow withdrew a blaster from his robe and pointed it at Sana. We have 2 of the aliens now. Unless the Hive promises to call off their attack, we shall kill them. Chapter 22. What do you think you're doing? Exclaimed Sisko, jumping to his feet. He stared at the small blaster that Jarrow held. It should have been detected before he entered the council chambers. Obviously, Jarrow had supporters, even on Shakar's staff. It should be obvious what I'm doing, Jarrow replied, irritated. I'm trying to save Bajor. He gestured with the gun. Now we have 2 hostages. They are under Starfleet protection, protested Sisko. I promised them safe passage, and I intend to keep my word. They're murderers and thieves, Jarrow said. You owe them nothing. I gave my word, Sisko growled, taking a step forward. Jarrow moved the blaster slightly to point it between Sana and Sisko. Captain, don't be foolish, he begged. I have no desire to harm you. That's odd, Sisko answered, because I have a strong urge to beat you to a pulp. I'm only doing this to save my world, Jarrow insisted, his eyes wavering between Sisko and Sana. As a result, he didn't see when Shakar moved in from behind. End of Side 5.